Hello, YouTube. I am going to make a comment on a video from Stefan molyneux of Free Domain. And it is a call-in show where a caller asks about one of the most fundamental questions possibly in philosophy, if isn't the most fundamental question of all. And it is interesting in several ways, not least because I'm very interested in philosophy, and I'm certainly interested in this question. Because if you sort of get to the wrong conclusion, the rest of your philosophy is potentially, or should, in my opinion, be considered invalid. So we are dealing with the utmost difficult and important questions of philosophy. And I'm going to try and give my comments as we go along. And let's just head into it.
All right. Well, this morning we have, this morning we have a caller who writes in. I am 41, happily married with 2 kids, considering homeschooling. I will have a conversation with Stefan about philosophy and share some of my philosophical ideas with him for his evaluation. I'm hoping Stefan can help me see my flaws in my reasoning and help me make my arguments more robust, or give me cause to abandon them. I imagine the conversation will involve a subset of the following: the relationship of the objective and the subjective, the nature of God, the existence of free will, if we live in a simulation, the nature of evil, the origins of communism and feminism, the relationship between personal responsibility and politics. I believe all this stuff is interconnected, so I've been imagining different paths the conversation could go. I think the point of origin I want to talk about is subjective experience, so I'd like to start here. Our conscious experience is a bottom-up simulation that necessitates the existence of free will and God within that simulation. I'd like that.
All right, well, welcome. Thank you for joining us, of course.
That was a bit of a mouthful from that caller. He's basically taking everything. I wanna answer to everything, all of the most important questions, both in politics and in philosophy and subjective, objective, and epistemology and so on. It's a bit of a unfocused question. I will give Stefan that. At least it's hard to maybe get a foothold where to start, but the listener does condense it into a more like, okay, let's start with subjectivity versus objectivity and the idea of the simulation. And that's the matrix problem, to refer to a more popular approach. But it's it comes in many forms. Ultimately it is the question of Cartesian doubt. It's about, it was made famous by the philosopher René Descartes, who in the middle of the 1600s wrote some meditations on philosophy. And most importantly, at least in this regard, is that he proposed a method of doubt about what you think you know. And basically, in my opinion at least, it takes what you understand in your everyday and then sort of peels off things from it one by one in a sort of in a structured manner, until you reach a point where you can no longer doubt. But this means, in my opinion, that we end up with metaphysics rather than knowledge, because these peeling off of the what you think you know will leave sort of an empty space where you have to figure out, what can I actually put in the knowledge basket and what can't I put in the knowledge basket? And why are there separate sort of groupings within my metaphysical understanding of my experience? and it switches over to become metaphysics at some point, right? And that's why I would have another approach than that of Descartes, but it's basically the same urge to understand the fundamental structure of your existence. And that's an important question, right? Can it be more important?
Today, a great pleasure to chat with you, and let's see how many of these we can bat around in the time that we have together. So I will let you start off the discussion.
Yeah, well, I'm not expecting us to bat them all around. I think where I'm going with this is that I like listening. I think you offer a great help to people, and I like listening to your show. And I think generally we end up in the same place, but maybe we have very different. We start from very different places, and I think that maybe we can iron some of that out. And I really would like, just, you know, I'd like you to Socratic method me and maybe help me with my ideas here. So like let's talk about conscious experience and this idea of living in a simulation, because I think that's actually a good place to start, because it's quite a popular idea now for people to talk about living in a simulation. And it's in something I haven't heard in the popular discourse is this idea that instead of it being some sort of top-down simulation, it's the reason we live in a simulation. We feel like we live in a simulation. We have this sort of experience of that is because we do live in a simulation, but it's a bottom-up simulation of our conscious experience, like trying to make some sense out of the objective universe around us into a model that has some utility. And that's why we have that sense of living in a simulation. And as we're provided more information from the internet and things around us, the simulation seems more prone to coincidence and bizarre things happening, just because there's more ties for us to have those patterns and that experience. I don't want to have
Sorry, so let's do it each other.
Comment on the caller is, I think it sounds decently well founded, his question, and he's open to be well, not manipulated, but receptive of arguments that would make his own philosophy more rigid and better, and he will be able to think clearer about these questions. It seems to me that the caller is quite overloaded with all sorts of inputs from east and west, and he can not in the geographical sense, but from all sorts of and you can't really get things. It's like a big puzzle. You can see that there's the pieces that fit together and some might not fit together, and he can't exactly put his finger. It seems to me he can't put his finger on exactly where there might be problem in his thinking, but he does have a sense that there is things that he can access and things that he can't access, and he can't really put his finger on where the problem is, but he does seem to think there's a problem in the metaphysics, in these metaphysics of where does my experience come from and how do I interpret it. And that is the foundational, in my opinion, metaphysics that has to be handled in order to reach to knowledge, or head on into doing knowledge, or doing epistemology to reach a definition of knowledge. So let's see what Stefan Molyneux says.
Each other a favor and try and cover as much ground as humanly possible. Yeah, without any intros. This audience is familiar with the arguments for and against the simulation. So let's just dive straight in. Yeah, of course, there are coincidences and there are ways. And I've had those kind of good.
His listeners are familiar with all the arguments for and against a simulation. Now, a simulation implies certain things. that there is an outside you have no access to, but there are some beings or some sort of existence that can manipulate you, that it's a simulation of something that you do not have access to, but it is simulated so you think you have access to it. But not particularly fond of that kind of analogy, that a simulation is something that implies that we could have knowledge of what it is trying to simulate. So if Stefan Molyneux gets this the wrong way, I would understand why, because it triggers a series of connected arguments that will lead to subjective only knowledge. And that doesn't sit well with Stefan Molyneux. And I mean, it wouldn't particularly sit well with me either, but I think I have a much more subjective approach to knowledge than Stefan Molyneux has. But let's see where it goes.
Goosebumpy moments where you're like, oh, I wonder if this happened for that reason, kind of thing. But of course, most of my day is not spent doing that, and naturally we are pattern recognizing creatures, right? So human beings are pattern recognizing creatures. So let's dive straight into arguments you feel that support the simulation thesis.
Yeah.
Arguments that supports, but I'm a little confused here, because why should it be that he should present only one side of the problem, as if he already puts the caller in one camp, as if he is in the other camp, and now he's sort of manipulating the caller into being a proponent of one side of the argument, so he can potentially attacking from the other side. That's a sophist trick, in my opinion. He doesn't embrace both sides of the argument, but he tries to force the caller into one corner, and he sets himself up in the other corner, and then he has already turned the debate into a combative, like a combat, where we are like two boxers in opposite sides of the ring, and we are going to meet in the middle, and then we are going to fight over this. I don't find that approach very good, because first of all, the caller was very open to change his mind about whatever he might be. If Stefan Molyneux could rigidify or make his philosophy more rigid, he would take that in. If he could find faults in his philosophy, he would take that in, and so on. But Stefan Molyneux already has sort of, I don't know how long time in advance he has information about the topic of the caller, and maybe he has wandered around for a few days thinking about this upcoming debate, and already put himself in that corner because he knows where it's going to end. Or maybe even he's going to make what's it called? Self-fulfilling prophecy. He's going to, because he have an idea where it's going to go, he's preparing himself for where it's going to go, and then it will come true because he is going to act as if it's the case. So I fear that it's going to be Stefan Molyneux kind of defending, or feeling that he's being attacked, and his whole philosophy is being attacked by subjectivism or something like that, right?
But I'm arguing, though, that it is a bottom-up simulation. So the reason why it feels like a simulation is
that was just to cut off the caller. I was not entirely sure what he means by bottom-up or top-down simulation. Does he mean that the simulation either comes from the outside, if he's sort of in a bubble of simulation, and outside that bubble there's a sort of demon, the Cartesian demon, giving him a simulation, or does the simulation come from somewhere inside the simulation, and the whole simulation is his own perception or his own experience that he can't differentiate from a simulation? So if that's what he means, then okay, that I'm good to go. But otherwise, I'm a little confused what he means about top down or bottom up.
Because that's what conscious experience is. We're evolved creatures, and we make sense of the world by creating a model of that world, and that's what gives us the sense of the simulation. So it's actually sort of like a hubris, or like a narcissistic pride, that we think that the universe is sort of made for us, and it's actually sort of like our sense of God it's atheists looking for God that sort of creates that desire to live in a simulation, or create arguments to have this sort of top-down simulation. Because if you think about it, it's very similar. It's like the idea of living in a simulation is very much.
It's a very complicated way of formulating what he's trying to philosophize about, because what he's basically, I don't know, he is very confused about how to attack this. That's what I would say. He doesn't know where to start or what foundation to stand on, and that's why he would need to do some kind of methodical doubt procedure to get back to some foundation where he can say, okay, I know this, I can make an axiom about this and then build from that, which is, in a classical philosophical sense, is René Descartes' method of doubt, which is an attempt of reducing what you know to the absolute basics, which is a basics of certainty, that which cannot be doubted. So he doesn't approach that kind of methodology. The methodology is always necessary, because you need to make sure that you take everything in, and not just take the easy path through philosophy and potentially arrive at the conclusion that you already want to arrive at, but that you take everything into consideration. Therefore, it has to be methodical. But he talks about gods and evolution and all sorts of stuff in one big pile, and it may not be exactly wrong what he says, but it's too fluffy. It's too we as human beings have this sort of incentive, and what his approach should be, he should look at himself, because he does not have access to what other people think. He is not sufficiently doubtful about his access to what other people are experiencing. He thinks that because there are other individuals or other minds, he has access to those experiences. Well, he doesn't. He takes that as an axiom, but without stating within his argumentation that is actually an axiom that he is founding his philosophy on. And either Stefan Molyneux should point that out, that he's not clarifying that axiom, or even further axioms that he is also jumping from, the idea of God and all sorts of things. And that should be the approach of the philosopher. Of the less experienced philosopher should sort of, okay, now I'm going to take the lead as the more knowledgeable philosopher, because you are arguing in a way that exposes sort of a lack of rigid philosophical thinking. So you are taking this as a foundation for your argument. So we can't go on further before I've clarified that you are either understanding this axiom and just pretending that it's not necessary to argue for it, or you are not even aware that you are stepping from that axiom. And all these traditions and other kind of presupposed or a priori axioms that people take for granted, or that I may, as a philosopher, may take for granted, I should, wind back and say, okay, that there's no foundation there unless I can argue for that foundation. So I have to cut it off. And that's where the philosophy should go. That's where the philosophical argumentation should go. That's the direction it should take.
Much like living in a video game, or whereas there's of course a programmer or someone who's making that for your pleasure. So it's sort of
I got to interrupt you here.
Okay.
What did you get out of what I said at the beginning? And you're free to disagree with it, but it really does bother me when people act as if I hadn't spoken. So I asked you not to describe the phenomenon as a whole, but to give me your strongest arguments for it. And you're doing nothing of the kind. And,
okay.
Maybe that's nerves or anything like that. I understand it's a bit of an odd forum to have these kinds of discussions, but
I don't exactly think this is appropriate. The guy is trying his best to present a philosophical topic that is very difficult to explain, because we are dealing in large parts, at least, with metaphysics, and metaphysics doesn't have a common language. It's a common debate in a common language, English, that doesn't have a vocabulary for metaphysical stuff. So he's using words like simulation and all these to transpose a common language into a metaphysical language, and that is possibly, in my opinion, where much of this kind of metaphysical philosophy grinds to a halt, because people have common ideas about the terms, these common terms, but since they're used in a metaphysical philosophy, it will be equivocating. You are equivocating common terms with metaphysical terms, and that is sort of the foundation for misunderstandings. So as an experienced philosopher, Stefan Molyneux should sort of carry him through the terms and the vocabularies, and let him have some space to try and explain using common language these metaphysical terms and epistemological terms or whatever, that are sort of a meta discussion compared to a common language discussion. So just, sort of, and that was what I feared. He would take a, boxing match approach to this, Stefan Molyneux, and say, you're not doing it right, you're not following the rules I have set, you are a bad philosopher, and I'm going to sort of, he should invite, it is called a philosophy show, right? It is called, he boasts that it's the greatest philosophy show, the biggest philosophy show, it's the only philosophy show, and come here and enjoy philosophy, and you are my best friends, and you are the best listeners. But when somebody calls in about one of the most foundational questions of philosophy, he basically attacks him, right? He basically finds some way to put him down or make him less comfortable discussing this, confusing him. He's obviously not the most trained philosopher, the call-in guy. And Stefan Molyneux apparently knows this, but he tries to make him insecure. In my opinion, there's a very great risk that his approach, like he's stopping and saying, you're not doing as you were told 2-3 minutes ago. You are a bad philosopher because you're not, all my listeners know everything about Cartesian doubt. They know everything about the method of doubting, and they know everything about a priori and a posteriori, or the matrix argument and the simulation argument. Just give me your stance, and then I'll pull it down. It's kind of first of all, it's very bad. It's a bad, maybe not a bad philosophy, but it's not an inclusive kind of philosophical debate. To put people on the defenses from the start, from the get-go, then it's not inclusive. And I could wonder why that is the case. Because I have the sense that unless people are deliberately trying to manipulate me in a philosophical debate, whether if they're using fallacies all the time, or they're using, ad hominems and trying to derail the debate, and then I could get the sort of combative. But a guy who calls in about one of the most important questions and clearly is open to other ways of doing it than his sort of middle of the road kind of approach to these questions. And the only conclusion I can reach regarding to Stefan Molyneux at this point is that his subconscious knows that his metaphysics doesn't work. But he has to follow that kind of metaphysics in order to reach some arguments further down the road, which is sort of the external objectivity and his ethical approach, which is called UPB, which needs to have a certain kind of metaphysics. So he's sort of reverse engineering his philosophy to a kind of metaphysics that has to be this way, otherwise the rest of my philosophy won't work. But that is really bad philosophy, because philosophers shouldn't start with what they have. And that's why I am not a big proponent of methodology or the Cartesian doubt approach. It's a good approach. It can open your eyes for how to be skeptical and doubtful about what you know, and how to approach metaphysics and epistemology. But starting with all your flaws and then trying to troubleshoot your way into what is left is an approach that will possibly leave things there that you don't want to remove. You should start at the other end with the basics and find out what the basics are, and then try to add things that only you can only add in an axiomatic approach, that you say, okay, I'm going to make an axiom that this is the case, and build from a series of axioms until you reach epistemology, until you reach a definition of knowledge. And then you can have the flux of changing appearances or perceptions of things that can be there or not be there, right? So maybe I went out of a tangent there, but let's see what's the next point.
I really do have to remind you that if I make a request, again, you're free to say no, I want to keep describing it, or tell me why. But yeah, you're not at least at liberty in this conversation.
No, that was the point I was trying to get to. Give the guy a break. Come on, man. I mean, most people, even philosophers, have a hard time explaining these things, and sort of half-ass attack of the caller for not complying with your wishes of how he should present this problem is sort of a dick, right? It's being dickish to throw the caller off so he will be less intimidating to your philosophy. That's the only conclusion I can draw, because that's the kind of the worst case to judging incentives in this debate. If you from the get-go almost directly throws off the other debater, then it must be because you don't want to go in a certain direction. You want to scare the debater into, I mean, I've seen you debating like, some 27-year-old virgin gym bunny who wants to be, forced up against the wall by her boyfriend, but he's too weak, and spent 45 minutes listening, or 2 hours listening to these practically no good problems, and debating this for hours. But the most important, or one of the absolute central problems in philosophy, everybody knows what the arguments are, just present it and do as I say. It sounds a bit like you're not really interested in having this discussion, or more importantly, you don't want to figure out that you might yourself be on the wrong side of the line, or have, supporting the wrong philosophy. You are simply too wedded to your arguments to be able to see things from another point of view, because all your books, all your podcasts, all your arguments, all your politics on whatever needs there to be a certain conclusion, and your philosophy has to arrive at that conclusion, and any topic brought on by the caller must end up in that direction. That's what I hear when I hear you talk.
To pretend I didn't say anything and just keep going on as if I didn't. That's kind of rude. In my humble opinion,
I'm sorry.
So,
okay, and maybe
just
I didn't mean to do
arguments.
that.
Let's get straight to it.
All right. So, I mean, my argument for why we're living in a bottom-up simulation is that we get that sense from our. I'm trying to find a point of contention.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Stefan Molyneux wanted. He wanted him to be so insecure that he doubts even, and he's afraid of saying anything out of fear of being attacked while he is on a live or at least a recorded show, and a fear of looking like a complete fool in this great philosopher, in the presence of the great philosopher Stefan Molyneux, who almost ridicules him for asking this question. I don't like that.
Or what we're disagreeing on. So maybe that could.
Well, so you're proposing a rather startling metaphysical idea. There are certain times when we know that we are living in a simulation.
Okay.
I had one of my very rare nightmares last night. I won't get into the details of it. It's not particularly important. I talked about it with my family this morning. But I had a nightmare. Now, I know that it was not real. I know that it was a simulation that was going on within my mind. We also enter into simulations when we're reading. I think in particular.
No. Now, Stefan Molyneux doesn't have because of the problem I said before, that the common language is used to describe metaphysical approaches or description of metaphysics. There's always a very big risk that the understandings are misinterpreted, that because there is no common description of metaphysical approaches to experience. So the caller uses the word simulation, that what you experience might not, the interpretation of your experience might not be the thing that the experience is trying to show you, if it is trying to show you anything. It's like a photograph of the moon is not the same as the moon. You can say that the photograph is kind of a simulation of the moon. But what if everything we experience are only photographs, not only of the moon, but of everything? What if everything we've got is only the photograph, not the real thing in itself? How can I, as a philosopher, find some way to figure out whether this is the case or is not the case. Stefan Molyneux goes astray from the get-go. He is comparing all of your experience with some part of your experience. He's taking some part of your experience and comparing it to the rest of your experience and say, if there's a discrepancy there, I have proved something. No, that's not what the caller is talking about. That is not what is the fundamental question here. It is whether or not all of your experience is only sort of in this metaphor of a photograph of the real thing. How can I see if it's the real thing or if it's just a photograph of a real thing which I do not have access to? Or do I have access to it in some way or another, right? This question is the foundational metaphysical question that Stefan Molyneux apparently fails to address, because it may be the case that he doesn't even understand that this is the real question. He's thinking that, okay, when some part of your experience at some point in time is that you are dreaming, and that could be seen as sort of a simulation where the mind simulates the waken period of your experience. And then you say, okay, when I wake up, I know that was a simulation, and now I'm awake, and that's where all the objective stuff is, and so on. And so what he says is, okay, so you're saying that everything is a dream. No, it's maybe it's due to the language used, as I mentioned before, that the common language doesn't necessarily transpose into a metaphysical language. But he's not talking about everything being like in a dream. He's saying that everything you experience might be a layer below the real stuff, but the layer below are like the photograph of the moon, not the moon itself, or the photograph of the bicycle, not the bicycle itself. How can you distinguish between whether or not what you experience is the real thing or just a sort of, quote, simulation of the real thing? That's what he asks. He doesn't say that it is either. He wants to have a tool, at least that's how I understand the caller, a tool to figure out whether or not what he experienced is a simulation of the thing or it's this thing itself. Because if you can be in doubt of something, if you can doubt, right? Is there possible to have subjective experience and objective experience? So it's not exactly clear whether or not what you experience is the thing itself, or it's just a, quote, simulation of something.
Really vivid novel. I've been listening back to my audiobook reading of my novel Almost, and it's very vivid to me. The characters, the locations, the people, the emotions, the relationships, all very vivid. Now, that's obviously a simulation. Some of the book is real, some of the book is historically accurate, and some of it is emotionally accurate or historically accurate, but not objective. In other words, the people are living in the time.
How do you know it's historically accurate? Did you experience that story or history that you're referring to in your novel? Did you experience that, or did you read it somewhere else? Did somebody else tell you this is what happened and you're just eating it raw? How do you know that Churchill lived? You only know it because it's on Wikipedia or there are books but you haven't experienced Churchill, have you? Right? He died in the 60s, so you couldn't possibly have met him or seen him. You only have sort of a legend or a history or something. But is that knowledge? I've heard about some guy called Cicero who apparently lived some 2,000 years ago in Rome. Do I know Cicero? Because somebody told me, or there's some statue somewhere. These are all they're sort of simulations, right? They're kind of simulations. So how many simulations do I need to have? If somebody comes and tells me I saw Santa Claus yesterday, well, do I then know Santa Claus? So what's the criteria for knowledge? It doesn't seem clear to me, at least. So if you're taking the knowledge approach and working backwards into metaphysics that way, well, then you have to tell us how you got to, right? How did you get to that knowledge? But that axiom doesn't appear anywhere in the discussion either. So you have some vivid characters in your book. So what? You could be lying. You could be saying that because you want to end up in a certain direction with your arguments. How the heck do we know? Do we just have to take your words for as knowledge? Well, how do you define that kind of knowledge? So the discussion is already halfway to the conclusion without stating what axioms you're building from.
I'm using the language they would have at the time, but the conversations are created, right? And so there are times when we know that we're living in a simulation, and that all makes perfect sense to me. Even when you're watching a very vivid movie, or I guess even when you're in a video game, right? You are in the brain of some level designer and someone who created the physics of the application and so on. So there are times when we know that we are in a simulation, dreaming, art, video games, and so on.
Yeah.
Now, and even if somebody's just sitting there telling a very compelling story, Graham Norton's show in the UK has, of course, all these very charismatic actors on who have, their 3 proven publicity stories, and they tell those stories very well. And that's kind of a simulation as well, in that we laugh and cry based upon the story, and it's not real and it didn't happen to us, but it hits us emotionally. So you're taking a thesis which everybody accepts, that there are some times where we live in a simulation, the most vivid being dreaming. But you're saying that a dream at night is functionally or fundamentally the same as our waking life, in that the dream is a simulation, but our waking life is also a simulation, and in a sense we never get to wake up. If that's what I understand by what you mean, then that's a thesis that needs to be defended or made the case of, right?
All right. So I think the distinction that I'm making is that there's utility in making these simulations, and whatever, like, we don't. I mean, it's sort of Kantian in the sense of that we don't have direct access to objective reality. That we have senses, and we have senses that bring in information, and then we have a way of interpreting that information, and what we create is a model of the world.
That's a very, very intelligent way of approaching. He's trying to not say more than he can stand for, but he's still trying to interpret what is going on. So he's approaching this, and he has an idea of Immanuel Kant's idea of the world that you can't access, but your representation in your mind is a picture of something, but that something is not what you access. You are accessing the picture of it, and that's completely right, because if something to be objective, it must be the object that is the center of the discussion. And if the object has to be central to the discussion, then we're discussing something that must be outside your body. And if it's outside your body, it's also outside of your mind. But if the information, if you call it that, has to reach both of, or at least to even more, potentially more debaters, they can't both have the object in their head or in their mind at the same time, because then it's not the same object they're discussing. If it's the objective, if it must be objective, there must be an object outside the body, and therefore also outside of their mind, that they are discussing. Otherwise, it can't be objective. So if it has to be objective, it must be outside your mind, but your mind is only inside your head or inside your brain. If the object is outside your brain, it must be of a different kind, that which is in your brain or in our brains, which we discuss. It can't be both, right? It can't both be inside your brain and outside your brain. If it's objective, it must be outside your brain. Otherwise, there's no point in discussing objectivity. So if it's outside your brain, but your mind is inside your brain, and there are two people discussing, so there are two experiences of that object outside both of their minds, which they are trying to reach objectivity about. But then they are discussing a reflection of it at most, right? They both have a reflection. They both have a picture of the moon that they are comparing to see, do we agree about this picture of the moon? And then if we agree about that picture of the moon, then we have reached objectivity. But there may be a third person or a fourth person or a fifth person who does not agree with them. Then there's not objectivity between those persons. But that doesn't mean that two persons over here can agree upon their reflection of that outside world. So if you're Stefan Molyneux, you have to agree that if you want to go to objectivity, you need to have an axiom that says that what you experience is not the thing itself. It just falls out of the argument. If you need to be objective, it's because two or more individuals need to agree upon an object. That's why it's called objective. It's the object that is not changing from two specific individuals that has to agree upon that object. They don't have to agree. If they don't agree, so be it. They don't agree about that particular object. So they cannot reach objectivity. But that doesn't mean that one of them or both of them could go to some third party or fourth party and reach objectivity about whatever object they need to reach objectivity about. But if you say that you can reach objectivity, you need to establish an axiom that says what you experience is not the thing itself. And then what you experience is a kind of simulation. It is a kind of simulation. What else could it be? You can find a better word than simulation because it has some connotations that is not necessarily good for the debate. But then what kind of language would you use? Because we don't have a language for metaphysics. We only have a common language for common things that we traditionally experience or refer to in a common language. So don't blame the guy for not having a language to describe his philosophy. So get with the point, get with the discussion, and help him frame what it is he's trying to say, or not frame. Frame is not. It has negative connotations, but help him formulate what the problem is, the good side, the one side and the other side, or whatever further sides there may be. But don't do this. You should formulate the question. Don't everybody knows what you're talking about in this very important question, in the central to philosophy, which, in my opinion, mostly everybody in the world disagree about. There are people who have the same kind of thought about it, but there's no consensus. If Stefan Molyneux is claiming there's consensus among his listeners, which, judging from the comments on his videos, not all of them, most biggest part of them don't seem like rigid philosophers to me. And everybody knows what this Cartesian doubt is all about, or the central metaphysical question. Bullshit. They don't. You just want to throw the debater or the caller off so that he doesn't, in my opinion, he doesn't challenge your faulty philosophy.
So that model of the world isn't. Is a shorthand we can say it's our experience of objective reality, but it's not the sum of objective reality, and it's a filter. It's filter reality, and much of what is out there we have no no understanding we have no understanding or even awareness of, because we need to make sense of it. We'd have to just grab onto a little bit of objective reality and sort of make sense of that. And we have utility. There's utility in doing that, making.
What he's trying to say, in my opinion, is, and now I'm interpreting, that we have to be rational about what we experience. We can reason about almost anything we want to reason about, but if you reason about some things, it might make us lose energy or make us less suitable for survival. Therefore, we tend to reason about those things that further our survival. And to make it short, I would say that rationality is reasoning about things that further your life. And therefore, when we experience things, there's probably a good reason why we experience it, because it furthers our life. It's an expression of our will in some way, right? If we didn't use our, at least some part of our experience for something, it seems like there's no point in having the experience after all, right? And being aware of the experience. So why would it be there if we didn't use it for something, if it wasn't useful? Because it seems to me at least that in some regards, we take what we experience and then sort of imagine some standard or way the world could be in the future. And what we rationalize about or reason about in a rational way is those ways that the world could go in the future, which we can, we can manipulate, or we can do something about to make it go there, right? I wouldn't sort of rationalize about how to get to the moon, because I can't see any way to go to the moon. So I'm not rationalizing about going to the moon, but I would be rationalizing about where to go to get my food, right? Because at some point in the near future, I'm going to need some food. So I'm going to rationalize if I take my bike, and if I bring some money, and if I bring a bag, and and I'm awake, and whatever is needed, and I would go to that building or that place, and I will do certain things, and then I will take my bike back to where I came from, and I put it in the fridge, and so on. That's a kind of a rational kind of reasoning, because it furthers my survival. But I am using my experience and my imagination to get to a certain point in the future. There's no promise, there's no certainty about it. It's just sufficiently safe, in my opinion, to rationalize or reason in this kind of fashion, in a rational fashion, to get to a point in the future where I want to be. So if I tend to be using my faculties, my senses, and my reasoning and my experience to get to certain points in the future with success, I am actually using my experience for something. And that's what the guy tries to, but even if it's a simulation, it seems to work in some fashion, right? It works in some fashion. It works. When I experience that and I behave like this, it has this consequence and it works. Sometimes it doesn't work, but most of the time it may work. And that's better. I can live with those few times it doesn't work, because it usually works. So the experience somehow coincides with what I tend to want to do. So there's some sort of meaning. There's some sort of built-in functionality within this supposed simulation. So am I the simulator? Or, I mean, it could be there's a sort of Cartesian demon outside that is giving me all these inputs. or central data or experience in a VAT, I can't argue against it. But so what? It works. So the central question then that I feel that the caller wants to get to is, how do I figure out whether it is a simulation in quotes or not? Or do I, and I think also, do I need to refute the simulation argument in order for my experience to have any kind of objectivity?
That story and making that sense of what part of objective reality you have access to.
So what part of, because you and I, in this conversation, we are using objective reality as the medium by which we conduct our discussion. Would you agree? At least what we describe as objective reality, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're also using language in our experience, our shared experience for that.
Well, no, sorry, just prior to the language stuff, we are using, you have a microphone, you may have a headset. We are using physics, sound waves, and so our auditory canals, and you name it.
No. Now you are referring to some experiences you have as being sort of ultimately everlasting objective experiences as an external to you. If you're referring to them as something that the other part is experiencing, it must be something outside yourself. You can't expect somebody to experience what you experience. So you're saying some part of your experience, which are the microphones and sound waves or whatever you seem to be able to experience, is objective. How did you reach that conclusion? Because they're all just some part of your experience. How did you end up with claiming this part of my experience is objective and this is only subjective or whatever? You haven't presented that axiom or that principle or that philosophy or whatever you want to call it, as if everybody knows this. That's bullshit. Bad philosophy.
Right, the little tiny hairs in the middle of your ear that give you the sound and so on, right? Right. So we are using all of the properties of objective reality in order to have this discussion.
Yeah.
So
it's the discussion is so derailed now that the caller can't even enlighten Stefan Molyneux on what it is he's trying to ask him, what questions he's asking. Stefan Molyneux has already a whole host of things he wants to say, and this is the case, this is the case, this is objective, and go fuck you if you don't agree with me, right? Then you are in the business of trying to destroy me and destroy my philosophy because I'm right? It's a recurring problem with. It's okay when he is dealing with callers who have some sort of social problem, or they have a drinking problem, or problem with family, or you're getting a girlfriend, a boyfriend, or whatever it is. He's great at that. But the central philosophical questions, he doesn't even identify them. He's going on a rant of his own and just pretending that everybody knows what objectivity is. He doesn't even seem to understand the significance of the question the caller is making. This is quite scary, in my opinion, that somebody claiming to be the sort of indirectly the greatest philosopher since Socrates don't even understand the question, the foundational question of metaphysics and epistemology, and just goes on like, slightly attacking the caller for being not acting according to his plan. I'm going to stop it here, and you can you yourself listen to the rest of the call, as I have done once. I listened to it a few days ago, and that's why I'm only slightly aware of what they're talking about. But I seem to remember that the second half of the show is Stefan Molyneux just ranting on about his own ideas, how great he is a philosopher, and how the caller has become his new disciple, and he has to go out into the world and tell the world about his philosophy, like sort of a Jesus of philosophy. And of course, I don't like that. It's ridiculous, right? It's sort of grandiose idea of how fantastic he is, and then he can't even give the caller the respect of understanding what the frick the question is he's trying to make. So, okay, go have some good time listening to this podcast, and afterwards you can go and listen to the original podcast, and have a nice day. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.